The blizzard struck on the day Grace Bennett's wagon overturned 3 miles outside of Lusk, Wyoming. And if Owen Vance hadn't been checking his trap lines that November afternoon in 1882, she would have frozen to death before sunset. Owen heard the crack of splintering wood before he saw anything through the swirling snow. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Sully, picked his way carefully through the deepening drifts toward the sound. What he found made his heart lurch. A wagon lay on its side, one wheel still spinning slowly in the wind. A woman in a dark traveling dress knelt beside it, her gloved hands frantically pulling at something trapped beneath the wreckage. "Madam," Owen called out, sliding from his saddle and stumbling through the snow toward her. "Madam, you need to get out of this weather." She looked up at him with eyes the color of spring grass, wide with panic and already rimmed with red from the cold. Her dark brown hair had come loose from its pins and whipped around her face. "My trunk," she gasped. "Everything I own is in there. I cannot leave it." Owen could barely feel his own face in the bitter wind. The temperature was dropping fast, and the sky held that particular gray quality that promised the storm would worsen before it improved. "Madam, if you stay out here arguing about a trunk, you will be dead in an hour. Now come on." He reached for her arm, but she pulled away, turning back to the overturned wagon. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip anything. Owen made a quick decision. He pulled his knife from his belt and cut through the leather straps holding the trunk. Then, with a strength born of necessity, he wrenched it free from the wreckage. It was heavy, probably filled with books or china or whatever else fancy ladies thought they couldn't live without. "Can you ride?" he asked her. Yes, I think so." "Then get on my horse, now." His voice left no room for argument this time. The woman seemed to finally grasp the severity of their situation. She let him help her into the saddle. Then he tied the trunk as best he could to the back of it before climbing up behind her. With one arm around her waist to keep her steady and the other holding the reins, Owen turned Sully toward home. His cabin was only 2 miles away, but it felt like 20. The woman, whose name he still did not know, trembled against him. He could feel the cold radiating from her body even through all their layers of clothing. She wore no proper winter coat, just a wool traveling jacket that might have been fine for a train car but was worse than useless against a Wyoming blizzard. "What is your name?" he asked, partly to keep her talking, partly because if they were going to be trapped together by this storm, he ought to know what to call her. "Grace," she said through chattering teeth. "Grace Bennett. Owen Vance. Where were you headed, Miss Bennett, Mrs. Bennett," she corrected automatically, then added, "I am a widow. I was traveling to Cheyenne. My husband's brother has a ranch there. He offered me a position as a housekeeper." Owen felt her slump against him, and he tightened his arm around her waist. "Stay awake, Mrs. Bennett. We are almost there." It was a lie. They still had at least a mile to go, and the snow was falling so thick now that Owen could barely see 10 feet ahead. He gave Sully his head, trusting the horse to find his way home. The wind howled like something alive and angry, cutting through every layer of clothing Owen wore. His face felt like leather stretched over bone. Grace made a small sound, something between a whimper and a sigh, and Owen realized she was crying. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry. This is all my fault." "Hush now," Owen said. "Save your strength." The wagon master said to wait. He said another storm was coming, but I was so anxious to get there to start my new life. I hired a driver who said he knew the route, that we could make it before the weather turned. But he took my money and abandoned me when the first snow started. Just drove off with my horse and left me there." Owen's jaw tightened. He had seen too many men like that, the kind who preyed on desperate people. "Well, he did not take everything. You are alive, and that is what matters. When the cabin finally emerged from the white curtain of snow, Owen nearly wept with relief. It was not much to look at, just a single room with a stone fireplace, but right now it looked like paradise. He half-carried Grace inside, set her down near the cold hearth, then went back out to tend to Sully and bring in the trunk. The wind nearly knocked him over twice, and by the time he got everything inside and the door barred against the storm, his hands were so numb he could barely feel them. The cabin was bitterly cold. Owen's first priority was getting the fire going. He had laid it before leaving that morning, a habit that now seemed providential, so all he had to do was strike a match. The kindling caught quickly, and soon flames were licking at the larger logs. Only then did he turn his attention back to Grace. She sat exactly where he had left her, hugging herself and shaking violently. Her lips had a blue tinge that Owen did not like at all. "Mrs. Bennett, I need you to stand up," he said gently. "You have to get out of those wet clothes." Her eyes widened, and even in her half-frozen state, she looked scandalized. "I certainly will not, madam. I am not trying to compromise your virtue. I am trying to save your life. Those clothes are damp from snow, and if you keep them on, you will freeze." When she still did not move, Owen went to his trunk in the corner and pulled out a thick flannel shirt and a pair of long underwear. They would be far too big for her, but they were dry and warm. "Here, put these on. I will turn my back." He did exactly that, facing the wall while he heard the rustle of fabric behind him. Grace's movements were clumsy and slow. Several times she made small sounds of frustration. Owen stared at a knot in the wood wall and tried not to think about the fact that there was a strange woman undressing in his cabin, or that she would be staying here for what might be days, or that she had the most beautiful eyes he had ever seen. "You can turn around now," Grace said finally, her voice small. When Owen looked, he had to suppress a smile. His clothes hung on her like a child playing dress-up in her father's wardrobe. She had rolled the sleeves up several times and belted the pants with what looked like a ribbon from her dress. Her dark hair hung in damp waves past her shoulders. Without all the layers of proper traveling attire, she looked younger than he had first thought, maybe 25 at most. "How old are you, Mrs. Bennett, if you do not mind me asking?" "23, she said. "Why, just wondering." Owen was 27 himself, though living alone in the wilderness for the past 3 years had probably aged him beyond his years. "Are you hungry?" Yes, actually. Very." Owen had been planning to spend the evening checking his traps and then heading into town, so his provisions were limited. He had beans and bacon, some cornmeal and a jar of molasses. There was coffee, thank God, and a small sack of withered apples from last fall. He set about making a simple meal while Grace sat by the fire, gradually stopping her shaking as the warmth seeped into her. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, looking around the sparse cabin. There was Owen's bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, a few shelves holding supplies, and his trunk. That was all, 3 years. "I built this place myself when I first came out here." "Where did you come from?" "Missouri. My family had a farm there. After my parents died, I sold it and headed west. Wanted to see the mountains, I guess. Live somewhere without so many memories." Grace nodded slowly. "I understand that feeling. I grew up in Ohio, married when I was 19. My husband was a banker, very respectable. We had a nice house in Cincinnati." She paused, staring into the fire. "He died of pneumonia last winter. We had only been married 3 years. No children. After he was gone, I realized I had nothing keeping me there. His brother wrote and offered me work, and I thought starting over somewhere new might help." "I am sorry for your loss," Owen said, and meant it. He had seen enough death in his time to know the hollow look it left in people's eyes. Grace had that look. They ate in companionable silence, the beans and bacon tasting better than any fancy meal after their ordeal in the storm. Outside, the wind continued to scream, rattling the door and finding every tiny crack in the cabin walls. Snow piled against the windows, blocking out what little light remained in the day. Owen lit 2 oil lamps, filling the cabin with warm yellow light. "You should sleep," he said when they had finished eating. "Take the bed. I will sleep on the floor by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Grace protested. "This is your home. You have already done so much for me." "Mrs. Bennett, I insist. You have had a terrible shock and you need proper rest. I have slept in worse places than a warm cabin floor, believe me." She looked like she wanted to argue more, but exhaustion won out. Grace made her way to the bed and lay down carefully, as if afraid she might break it. Owen spread his bedroll on the floor near the hearth and lay down fully clothed, his gun within easy reach out of habit. "Mr. Vance." Grace's voice came soft from the darkness. "Yes, thank you for saving my life. You are welcome. Now get some sleep." Owen listened to her breathing gradually slow and deepen. The fire crackled. The wind howled. And for the first time in 3 years of living alone in this cabin, Owen felt the presence of another person as something more than an intrusion. It felt almost like coming home. Morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind blew harder and the snow fell thicker. When Owen opened the door to check on conditions, he had to shove against a drift that came up to his waist. The cold that blasted into the cabin made Grace gasp from where she stood by the fire. "We are snowed in," Owen said, forcing the door closed again. "This storm is not letting up any time soon." Grace wrapped her arms around herself. She was still wearing his oversized clothes and her hair was braided loosely over one shoulder. "How long do you think it will last?" "Hard to say. Could be a day. Could be a week. We have enough food and firewood to last a while, but we will need to ration carefully." Owen looked at her seriously. "I want to be straight with you, Mrs. Bennett. This is an early winter storm, but it is a bad one. Even after it passes, the snow will be deep. Travel will be difficult if not impossible. You may be stuck here for some time." He watched Grace absorb this information. Her face went pale, then she nodded. "I understand. I will try not to be a burden to you." "You are not a burden, but we should discuss some practical matters. This is a small cabin, and we are going to be in close quarters. We will need to respect each other's privacy as much as possible and work together to get through this." "Of course. Please tell me what I can do to help. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, anything you need." Over the next few days, they fell into a routine. Owen would tend to the fire and bring in wood from the covered pile just outside the door, a task that required shoveling through fresh snow each time. Grace took over the cooking, and Owen had to admit she was better at it than he was. She could make even his humble supplies taste good, adding herbs from a small pouch in her trunk and knowing just how long to let the beans simmer. They talked to pass the time. Owen learned that Grace had been educated at a female seminary, that she loved reading, that her favorite season was spring when everything came back to life. Grace learned that Owen had fought in the Indian Wars for 2 years before buying his discharge, that he preferred the company of animals to most people, that he had never been in love. "Never?" Grace asked, looking up from the sock she was mending. She had discovered holes in half of Owen's socks and insisted on fixing them. "Never," Owen confirmed. "Came close once maybe when I was younger, but she married my brother instead. That must have hurt. At the time, yes. But looking back, I think I was more in love with the idea of being in love than I was with her. They are happy together, have 4 children now. I get letters sometimes." Grace set down her mending and stared into the fire. I loved my husband. But I do not think I was in love with him, if that makes sense. He was kind to me, and I was grateful for that. But there was no passion, no fire. Sometimes I would read novels about great romances and wonder if I was missing something. Maybe you were too young when you married. Maybe. I was 19 and thought I knew everything about the world. Now I am 23 and realize I know almost nothing. The storm lasted 5 days. 5 days of being trapped in a small cabin with a virtual stranger. And yet Owen found himself enjoying Grace's company more than he had enjoyed anyone's in years. She was intelligent and well-read, with opinions about things most women he knew would never have dreamed of discussing. She asked him about his time in the army, about the native tribes he had encountered, about his views on westward expansion. "I think it is wrong," Owen said one evening as they sat by the fire after supper. "What we are doing to the Indians, I mean. They were here first. This was their land. And we just took it, killed them if they resisted, forced them onto reservations. I fought in those wars, and I am not proud of it." "Then why did you do it?" Grace asked gently. "Because I was young and stupid and thought it was my duty. Because the army told me they were savages, and I believed it. Took me a while to realize that the real savages were often wearing the same uniform I was." Owen rubbed his face tiredly. "I got out as soon as I could, came out here to get away from all that." "You are a good man, Owen Vance," Grace said softly. It was the first time she had used his given name, and something about hearing it in her voice made Owen's heart beat a little faster. He looked at her across the firelight, at the way the flames painted her face in gold and shadow, and felt something shift inside him. On the 6th day, the storm finally broke. Owen woke to sunlight streaming through the gaps in the snow-covered windows and silence, blessed silence, without the constant howl of wind. He rose carefully, trying not to wake Grace, and opened the door. The world outside was transformed. Snow covered everything in smooth white drifts, some as tall as Owen himself. The trees were laden with it, their branches bent low. The sky was a brilliant crystalline blue, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. It was beautiful and deadly in equal measure. "Oh my!" Grace's voice came from behind him. She had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and came to stand beside him in the doorway. "I have never seen so much snow." "We will need to dig out," Owen said. "And I will need to check my traps, see if any animals are in distress. But the main thing is firewood. We are going to need a lot of it." "I can help," Grace offered. "You do not have proper clothes for this weather. Your dress is still damp." Grace looked down at the oversized clothes she wore. "Then I will wear these. They may not fit well, but at least they are warm." So they worked together, Owen shoveling paths through the snow while Grace helped haul wood and stack it inside the cabin. It was hard, exhausting labor, and by midday they were both breathing hard, their breath pluming white in the frigid air. But Owen found himself constantly aware of Grace's presence. The way she never complained, the determination in her eyes, the sound of her laughter when she slipped and fell into a snowdrift. He was falling for her. The realization hit him like a physical blow as he watched her brush snow from her hair, her cheeks flushed pink from cold and exertion. He was falling for Grace Bennett, this widow from Ohio who had stumbled into his life by accident and would leave as soon as spring made the trails passable. That night, as they sat by the fire eating venison stew that Grace had made from one of the rabbits in Owen's traps, he found himself memorizing details about her. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The small scar on her right hand from a childhood accident with a kitchen knife. The sound of her voice when she read aloud from one of the books she had packed in her trunk. "Owen," she was looking at him curiously. "Are you all right? You seem distracted." "I am fine," he lied. "Just tired from all the shoveling." But that night, lying on his bedroll by the fire while Grace slept in his bed, Owen stared at the ceiling and faced the truth. He was more than falling for her. He was already halfway in love with her, and it terrified him. The days that followed established a new rhythm. The storm had passed, but the deep snow and bitter cold made travel impossible. Owen knew the trail to Lusk would be impassable for weeks, maybe months. Any wagons or riders trying to make it through would end up like Grace's wagon had, overturned in a drift or stuck fast. They were trapped together until spring, and the knowledge sat between them like a living thing. "I should get word to my brother-in-law," Grace said one morning as she made breakfast. "He will be worried when I do not arrive." "There is no way to get a message out until the trail's clear," Owen said. "I am sorry." Grace turned from the stove, a wooden spoon in her hand. "This must be such an imposition for you, having me here, eating your food, taking up space in your home." "Grace." Owen stood and crossed to where she stood. They were close enough now that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "You are not an imposition, I want you to know that." "But I am disrupting your whole life. You did not ask for any of this." "No, but I am not sorry it happened. Are you?" Grace looked up at him and something passed between them, something electric and alive. "No," she whispered, "I am not sorry." Owen knew he should step back, put distance between them, but he could not make himself move. They stood there, caught in a moment that seemed to stretch and bend like taffy, until finally Grace broke eye contact and turned back to the stove. "Breakfast is ready," she said, her voice not quite steady. December passed in a blur of snow and cold and growing warmth between them. Owen taught Grace how to shoot his rifle in case of emergencies. She was a surprisingly good shot once she got over her fear of the recoil. Grace taught Owen how to play chess using a set she had in her trunk, and they spent long evenings locked in strategic battles over the board. They talked about everything and nothing. Grace told him about her childhood, about the sister who had died of scarlet fever when Grace was 12, about the mother who had never quite recovered from that loss. Owen told her about growing up on a farm, about the brother who had stolen his girl, about the way he had felt trapped by the expectations of small-town life. "You ever miss it?" Grace asked one snowy afternoon as she kneaded bread dough on the table. "Having family nearby, being part of a community, sometimes," Owen admitted. He was oiling his saddle, a task he had been putting off. "But mostly I like the solitude, or at least I did before." "Before what?" "Before you." The words were out before Owen could stop them. He looked up and found Grace staring at him, her hands still in the dough. "I mean, having you here has made me realize that maybe solitude is not all it is cracked up to be." Grace's expression was unreadable. "Owen, we should talk about what happens when spring comes." "I know. I will need to leave. Continue on to Cheyenne. My brother-in-law is expecting me and I need the position he is offering. I have no other prospects." "I understand." Owen's hands stilled on the leather. "But Grace, spring is still months away. A lot can change in months." "What are you saying?" Owen set aside the saddle and crossed to the table. "I am saying that I care about you, more than I should, probably, and I think maybe you care about me too." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she resumed kneading. "It does not matter what we feel. I cannot stay here forever, living in sin with a man I am not married to. Even out here there are standards of decency." "Then marry me." The words hung in the air between them. Grace's hands stopped moving entirely. She looked up at Owen with wide eyes. "What?" "Marry me," Owen said again, more firmly this time. "Stay here, not as my housekeeper or my guest, but as my wife." "Owen, you cannot be serious. We have only known each other a month, I know. but I also know that I am happier with you here than I have been in years. I know that I look forward to waking up every morning because it means another day of talking with you, laughing with you, just being with you. I know that the thought of you leaving come spring makes me feel like someone is reaching into my chest and squeezing my heart." Grace stepped back from the table, wiping flour from her hands. "This is insane. We barely know each other. You saved my life and I am grateful, but that is not the same as love." "Isn't it?" Owen challenged. "Grace, I am not asking you to decide right now. I am just asking you to think about it. We have all winter. Get to know me better. Let me get to know you. And then, when spring comes, if you still want to leave, I will take you to Cheyenne myself. And if I decide to stay, then we will get married, and you will never have to worry about being alone or without prospects again. We will build a life together here." Grace turned away, staring out the small window at the endless expanse of white. "This is happening too fast." "I know," Owen said softly, "but out here in this country, sometimes fast is all we get. Life is hard and short, and when you find something good, something worth holding on to, you do not let it go just because it did not happen on society's prescribed timeline." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said, "I will think about it. But Owen, I need you to understand something. If I stay, it will not be because I need rescuing or because I have no other options. It will be because I choose you, because I want to be here. Can you accept that?" "Yes," Owen said without hesitation. "That is exactly what I want." Christmas came, marked only by the fact that Owen knew the date and mentioned it. He had no decorations, no special food prepared, but Grace insisted they should mark the occasion somehow. She used some precious flour and sugar to make cookies, and Owen went out in the bitter cold to cut a small pine tree, which they propped in a corner and decorated with paper ornaments Grace folded from pages of an old newspaper. "It is not much," Grace said, looking at their humble tree. "It is perfect," Owen replied, and he meant it. They sat by the fire that evening, sipping coffee with a splash of whiskey in it, and Grace said quietly, "Tell me about your dreams, Owen. If you could have anything in the world, what would it be?" Owen considered the question carefully. "I would want to expand this place. Build a bigger cabin, maybe even a proper house eventually. Get some cattle, start a small ranch. Nothing huge, just enough to make a living and leave something behind when I am gone." He paused. "And I would want someone to share it with. Someone to build that dream with me." "That sounds like a good dream," Grace said softly. "What about you? What are your dreams?" Grace was quiet for so long that Owen thought she might not answer. Finally, she said, "I always wanted children, a family. My husband and I tried, but it never happened. I had started to think maybe I was not meant to be a mother, but I still hope sometimes that maybe it could still happen." "It could," Owen said. "You are young, you have plenty of time." "Maybe," Grace sipped her coffee. "I also always wanted to do something that mattered. Not just keep house and raise children, as important as those things are. I wanted to teach, maybe, or help people in some way. Make a difference." "There is always need for teachers out here," Owen said. "Families spread out across ranches, children growing up without any education. If you stayed, you could do that. Teach the local children." Grace turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You have thought about this?" "I have thought about little else for weeks now." She reached out and touched his hand where it rested on his knee. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact, and Owen felt the touch like electricity racing up his arm. "Owen, I need to be honest with you about something." "All right." "I am scared, terrified actually. My marriage was not unhappy, but it was not what I dreamed of either. It was comfortable, predictable, safe. And then it was over, and I had to figure out who I was without it. Coming west was supposed to be my chance to start fresh, to build a new life on my own terms. But now here I am, in almost the exact same situation, being offered security and comfort in exchange for marriage. It is not the same, Owen said firmly. I am not offering you comfort and security. I am offering you a partnership. Yes, it would be nice to have someone to help with the work, someone to share the burden of survival out here. But that is not why I want you to stay. I want you to stay because when I look at you, I see someone I could spend my life with and never get bored. I see someone strong enough to survive out here, smart enough to challenge me, kind enough to make me want to be a better man. I want you to stay because I am falling in love with you, Grace, and I think maybe you are falling for me too. Tears shimmered in Grace's eyes. I am, she whispered. I am falling for you, and it terrifies me because what if I am just latching onto the first person to show me kindness? What if I am just grateful and I am confusing that with love? Owen shifted closer, taking both her hands in his. Then we wait. We take our time. We get through this winter, and when spring comes, if you still are not sure, you can go to Cheyenne as planned. I will not hold you here. But Grace, I really hope you will choose to stay. She leaned forward until her forehead rested against his. Ask me again in spring, she breathed. When the snow melts and the trails are clear. Ask me again then, and I will give you my answer. I will, Owen promised. They sat like that, hands clasped, foreheads touching, until the fire burned low and the cold crept in. Then Owen built up the fire again, and they went to their separate sleeping places, but something had changed between them. Some barrier had been crossed. January was brutal. The temperatures dropped so low that water froze solid in minutes, and going outside for even a short time was dangerous. Owen and Grace stayed close to the cabin, venturing out only when absolutely necessary. They were running low on supplies, rationing carefully to make everything last. We will be fine until spring, Owen assured Grace when he saw her eyeing their dwindling stores with worry. I have done this before. It looks worse than it is. But privately, he was concerned. If the winter lasted as long as the last one had, they would be cutting things very close. He increased the number of snares and traps he set near the cabin, hoping to catch more rabbits and small game to supplement their diet. One particularly cold night, Grace woke from a nightmare, crying out in the darkness. Owen was up instantly, crossing the cabin to where she sat in his bed, shaking and gasping. Hey, it is all right, he said softly. You were dreaming. You are safe. I am sorry, Grace said, wiping at her tears. I did not mean to wake you. What were you dreaming about? Grace pulled the blankets around herself. I was back in the storm in the overturned wagon, but this time you did not come. I was alone and the cold was seeping in, and I knew I was going to die there. Without thinking, Owen sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her into his arms. Grace came willingly, burying her face against his shoulder. I am here, he murmured. I found you. You are safe. They stayed like that for a long time, Grace's shaking gradually subsiding. When she finally pulled back, her face was inches from Owen's. In the dim light from the banked fire, her eyes were dark and luminous. Grace, Owen said, his voice rough. I should go back to my bedroll. I know, she whispered. But neither of them moved. The kiss, when it happened, was inevitable. Their lips met softly, tentatively, a question more than a statement. Grace's hands came up to rest on Owen's shoulders, and he cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away the last of her tears. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Owen forced himself to stand. I am sorry. I should not have done that. I wanted you to, Grace said softly. But you are right. You should go. I need time to think, and I cannot do that when you are this close. Owen went back to his bedroll, but he did not sleep. He lay awake listening to Grace's breathing eventually slow and deepen, replaying that kiss over and over in his mind. She had kissed him back. That had to mean something. February brought a brief warming trend. The temperatures climbed above freezing for several days in a row, and the snow began to melt. Owen's spirits rose. Maybe spring would come early this year. Maybe the trails would be clear by March, and Grace could make her decision sooner. But then a late storm rolled in, even worse than the first one had been. For 3 days, the wind howled and the snow fell so thick that Owen could not see the trees just beyond the cabin. They were trapped inside, burning through their firewood at an alarming rate to keep the cold at bay. On the second day of the storm, Grace became quiet and withdrawn. She moved through their daily routines mechanically, barely speaking. Owen tried to draw her out, but she deflected his attempts at conversation with single-word answers. Finally, on the third day, as they sat by the fire eating a meager supper of beans and cornbread, Owen said, "Talk to me, Grace. What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. You have barely spoken to me in 3 days. If I did something to upset you, I need to know what it is." Grace set down her bowl and looked at him. "You did not do anything wrong. I am just thinking about the future, that is all. And I am terrified that I am making another mistake, that I am letting my circumstances dictate my choices instead of making decisions based on what I truly want." Owen set his own bowl aside. "What do you truly want, Grace?" "I do not know." The words burst out of her with more force than Owen had expected. "I thought I knew. I thought I wanted independence, a chance to make my own way in the world. But now I am here with you, and I am happy, and that scares me because what if I am just settling again? What if I am choosing the easy path instead of the right one?" "How is staying here with me the easy path?" Owen asked. "Grace, life out here is hard. Ranching is back-breaking work. The winters are brutal. The nearest town is 3 miles away, and it is not much of a town. You would be isolated for months at a time, working from dawn until dusk just to survive. There is nothing easy about any of that. But it would be easier than being alone," Grace said quietly. "It would be easier than trying to make my own way in Cheyenne, working as a housekeeper for a man I barely know, having no family, no friends, no one to rely on." Owen crossed the small space between them and knelt in front of where Grace sat. "Listen to me. If you stay, I do not want it to be because it is easier. I want it to be because you want to build a life with me, because you can imagine waking up next to me for the rest of your life and not feeling trapped. Because when you look at me, you see a partner, not just a provider. Can you do that? Can you see that when you look at me?" Grace reached out and touched his face, her hand soft against his bearded cheek. "When I look at you, I see the man who saved my life. I see someone kind and strong and honest. I see someone I could very easily love if I let myself." "Then let yourself," Owen said. "Stop overthinking everything. Stop being afraid of making a mistake. Just feel, Grace. What does your heart tell you?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "My heart tells me to stay. My heart tells me that I have never felt as safe or as valued as I do when I am with you. My heart tells me that leaving would be the biggest mistake of my life." "Then stay," Owen said simply. "Marry me in the spring when the preacher can make it out from Lusk. Build a life with me here. We will make mistakes, probably lots of them, but we will make them together. You make it sound so simple. Maybe it is simple. Maybe we are the ones making it complicated." Grace leaned forward and kissed him, and this time Owen let himself kiss her back fully, without restraint. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Grace whispered, "I will give you my answer in the spring like I promised. But Owen, I think you should know that my heart is already made up." "What is it telling you?" "It is telling me to stay." March arrived with more snow, but the storms were briefer now, and between them came days of brilliant sunshine that turned the snow to glittering diamonds. Owen and Grace began preparing for spring, talking about what they would plant in a garden, what improvements they could make to the cabin. Grace found that she had a talent for trapping. She set snares near the cabin and checked them daily, contributing to their food supply. Owen taught her how to skin and prepare the rabbits and other small game she caught, and though she was squeamish at first, she learned quickly. They also grew more comfortable with each other physically. Nothing improper happened, but there were more touches now, more casual intimacy. Owen would rest his hand on Grace's shoulder as he passed behind her. Grace would lean against him as they sat by the fire in the evenings. They were learning each other, becoming accustomed to sharing space and lives. One evening in late March, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Grace said, "Tell me about the seasons here. What is spring like?" Owen leaned back in his chair, a rare smile crossing his face. "Spring is beautiful. The snow melts and the whole world turns green almost overnight. Wildflowers cover the meadows, every color you can imagine. The river, which is frozen solid right now, thaws and runs fast and cold with snowmelt. Animals come out of hibernation, and suddenly the world feels alive again after the long death of winter. It sounds wonderful. It is. And summer is even better. Long days, warm sunshine, everything growing. You can hear the birds singing from dawn until dusk. The nights are cool but comfortable. It is my favorite time of year. When do you think the trails will be clear enough for travel?" Owen's smile faded slightly. "Hard to say. Could be late April, could be early May. Depends on how fast the snow melts and whether we get any more late storms." Grace was quiet for a moment, then said, "Owen, I have been thinking." "About what?" "About my brother-in-law in Cheyenne. About the fact that he is expecting me, that he has been worried for months now about what happened to me." Owen's chest tightened. "Are you saying you want to go to him after all?" "No," Grace said firmly. "I am saying that as soon as the trails are clear, we should send him a letter explaining what happened and letting him know I am safe. I do not want him to keep worrying." "We can do that," Owen agreed, relief flooding through him. "We will go into Lusk as soon as possible and send a letter. And while we are there," Grace continued, her cheeks flushing pink, "we should speak to the preacher about performing a marriage ceremony." Owen's heart began to race. "Grace, are you saying?" "I am saying yes," Grace interrupted, looking up at him with those beautiful green eyes. "I am saying that I do not need to wait until spring to give you my answer because I already know what it is. I want to stay. I want to marry you. I want to build a life together here in this wild, beautiful place." Owen pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight he was afraid he might hurt her. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely sure, I am sure," Grace said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I love you, Owen Vance. I think I have loved you since the day you risked your life to pull me out of that storm." "I love you too," Owen said, the words feeling both strange and right on his tongue. "I have never said that to anyone before, but I mean it. I love you, Grace." They kissed again, and this time there was joy in it and promise and hope for the future. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying at the same time, Owen said, "We should set a date." "As soon as possible after the trails clear," Grace said. "I do not want to wait any longer than necessary." "Neither do I." April brought the thaw in earnest. The snow began to melt rapidly, forming rivers of icy water that rushed down every slope and gully. The roof of the cabin dripped constantly, and the ground around it turned to mud. Owen and Grace ventured outside more often now, breathing in air that smelled of wet earth and new growth. The trails remained impassable, still choked with snow in the shadowed valleys and prone to mudslides where the snow had melted. But Owen knew it would not be long now. Another few weeks, maybe less, and they would be able to make it to Lusk. In the meantime, they planned. Grace wanted a garden, so they cleared a plot near the cabin and discussed what to plant. Owen wanted to expand his trap lines and maybe get a few chickens. They talked about building a larger cabin next year, one with a separate bedroom and a real kitchen. "We will need more space when children come," Grace said one day as they worked in the garden plot, pulling rocks from the soil. Owen looked up sharply. "Are you?" "No," Grace said quickly, blushing. "Not yet, I just meant eventually. We will want more room." "Right, of course." Owen went back to his work, but his mind was racing ahead to a future where this cabin held the sound of children's laughter, where Grace was not just his wife but the mother of his children. On the first day of May, Owen declared the trail to Lusk passable. They set out on Sully, Grace riding in front of Owen like that first terrible day, but this time her reason for being in his arms was joy rather than desperation. The journey took most of the day. The trail was muddy and treacherous in places, but they made it through without incident. Lusk was a small town, barely more than a wide spot in the trail with a handful of buildings. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and a small church that doubled as the schoolhouse. The population swelled during cattle drives but was sparse the rest of the year. Their arrival caused something of a stir. Owen rarely came to town, maybe once every few months for supplies. And Grace, wearing one of her refurbished dresses from the trunk, drew curious stares from the townspeople. They went first to the general store, where Owen introduced Grace to Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, the proprietors. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline when Owen explained that Grace would be staying, that they intended to marry. "Well, congratulations, Mrs. Henderson said, though her tone suggested she had questions about the propriety of Grace having spent the winter in Owen's cabin. "I suppose you will be wanting to speak to Pastor Reynolds." "We will," Owen confirmed, "but first we need to send a letter." They drafted a letter to Grace's brother-in-law, explaining the situation in as much detail as seemed appropriate. Grace assured him she was safe and well cared for, and that she would not be coming to Cheyenne after all. She thanked him for his offer of employment and wished him well. Mr. Henderson promised to include the letter in the next mail run, which would leave in 2 days. Then they went to find Pastor Reynolds. He was an older man with a long gray beard and kind eyes, and he listened to their story without judgment. When they had finished, he said, "I can perform the ceremony this Sunday if you like. That gives me time to post the banns and make sure everything is done properly." "This Sunday would be perfect," Grace said, squeezing Owen's hand. They spent the rest of the afternoon buying supplies. Owen had some money saved from selling furs, and he spent it freely now, buying things he never would have considered before. A bolt of fabric for Grace to make new dresses, seeds for the garden, coffee and sugar and flour. A chicken coop in pieces that he would have to assemble, along with 6 laying hens. "We are going to be eating well this summer," Grace said, laughing at Owen's enthusiasm. "I want you to have everything you need," Owen said seriously. "I know it will be a hard life, Grace, but I want to make it as comfortable for you as I can." "I do not need comfort," Grace said. "I need you. Everything else we can figure out together." They stayed in Lusk that night, Owen sleeping in the loft of the blacksmith shop while Grace stayed with Mrs. Henderson. It felt strange to be apart after spending every day and night in close proximity for 6 months, but it was only for 2 nights, and then they would be married and together for the rest of their lives. On Sunday morning, Grace emerged from Mrs. Henderson's boarding room wearing her best dress, which she had pressed and mended. Her dark hair was pinned up, and she carried a small bouquet of early spring flowers that Mrs. Henderson had helped her gather. Owen wore his cleanest clothes and had trimmed his beard. He waited at the front of the small church, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. A small crowd had gathered, curious townspeople who wanted to see the hermit from the hills get married. When Grace walked down the aisle toward him, Owen forgot to breathe. She was beautiful, more beautiful than he had ever seen her. But it was not just her physical appearance that struck him. It was the light in her eyes, the smile on her face, the way she looked at him like he was the only person in the world. Pastor Reynolds conducted a simple ceremony. They exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. Owen slipped a simple gold band on Grace's finger, one he had purchased from Mr. Henderson just the day before. It was not fancy, but it was solid and would last. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Pastor Reynolds said. "Owen, you may kiss your bride." And Owen did, there in front of God and the whole town, kissing his wife for the first time as a married man. The small congregation applauded, and Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. They spent their wedding night in the boarding house, in a small room with a real bed and a window that looked out over the main street of Lusk. Owen held Grace in his arms, still hardly able to believe this was real, that she was his wife now. "Are you happy?" he asked her as they lay in the darkness. "Happier than I have been in years," Grace replied. "Maybe happier than I have ever been. No regrets. None." Grace shifted so she could look at his face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "You gave me my life back, Owen. You saved me from freezing to death in that storm, yes, but you did more than that. You showed me that I could be strong, that I could survive, that I could build something new and good from the wreckage of my old life. You gave me hope when I had none." "You did the same for me," Owen said. "I did not realize how lonely I was until you were there, how empty my life had become. You filled spaces in my heart I did not even know were empty." They made love for the first time that night, slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies the way they had learned each other's hearts over the long winter. Afterward, Grace fell asleep in Owen's arms, and he lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathe and thinking about how strange life was, how a terrible storm could lead to the greatest blessing he had ever known. The next morning, they loaded their supplies onto Sully and began the journey back to the cabin. Owen had tied the coop containing the chickens to the back of the saddle, and the birds clucked and squawked the entire way. Grace laughed at their indignant noises, and Owen found himself laughing too. When they crested the final hill and the cabin came into view, nestled in its clearing with the mountains rising behind it, Grace said, "Home." "Home," Owen echoed. And for the first time in his life, he truly felt like he had one. The months that followed were the happiest of Owen's life. He and Grace fell into a rhythm of work and rest, of building and growing. The garden flourished under Grace's care, providing fresh vegetables to supplement their diet of game meat. The chickens began laying eggs, a luxury Owen had almost forgotten. They worked from dawn until dusk most days, but it was good work, satisfying work. Owen taught Grace to ride Sully properly, and soon she was confident enough to accompany him when he checked his trap lines. Grace taught Owen to read better, spending evenings by the fire working through books from her trunk. In late summer, they made another trip to Lusk for supplies. This time, they were greeted as a married couple, as part of the community. Mrs. Henderson insisted they stay for supper, and they spent the evening hearing all the town gossip. A new family had moved in to try their hand at ranching. The Hendersons' daughter was engaged to a cowboy from Cheyenne. The railroad was talking about extending a line through this part of Wyoming, though no one believed it would actually happen. On the ride back to the cabin, Grace was quiet. Owen finally asked if something was wrong. "I am not sure," Grace said slowly. "Owen, I think I might be pregnant." Owen nearly fell off the horse. "You think?" Are you sure? Not certain yet, but I have missed my monthly courses and I have been feeling sick in the mornings. I did not want to say anything until I was more sure, but... Owen pulled Sully to a stop and turned Grace in the saddle so he could see her face. "That is wonderful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Grace, that is the best news you could give me. You are not upset." "Upset? Why would I be upset?" "Because it is happening so soon. Because we have barely been married 4 months. Because we are not ready, we do not have enough space, we—" Owen stopped her spiral with a kiss. "We will be ready," he said firmly. "We have months to prepare. And Grace, there is nothing I want more than to have a family with you." Tears streamed down Grace's face, but she was smiling. "I was so afraid you would think it was too soon, that we needed more time." "There is never a perfect time for anything," Owen said, "but this feels pretty close to perfect to me." As summer turned to fall, Grace's pregnancy became obvious. Her belly swelled, and she had to let out her dresses. Owen worked like a man possessed, adding a small additional room to the cabin to serve as a nursery, stockpiling firewood and supplies for the winter, hunting and preserving meat. Grace insisted on continuing to work despite Owen's protests that she should rest. She tended the garden until the first frost, preserving and pickling everything they could not eat fresh. She made tiny clothes from scraps of fabric, her hands moving constantly as she prepared for the baby's arrival. In October, they went to Lusk one last time before the winter set in. Mrs. Henderson had offered to come stay with them when Grace's time came, to help with the birth. Grace accepted gratefully, knowing that having an experienced woman present would give Owen peace of mind. "When should I come?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "The baby should arrive in late February or early March," Grace said. "If the weather allows, could you come in February and stay until after the birth?" "Of course, dear. I will be there." That winter was easier than the last, though it had its challenges. The cabin was warmer and more comfortable now, and they had plenty of supplies. But Grace was uncomfortable in the late stages of pregnancy, and Owen worried constantly about her. What if something went wrong? What if the baby came early, before Mrs. Henderson could arrive? But Grace remained calm and confident. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him. "I will be fine. We will be fine." In mid-February, Mr. Henderson brought his wife to the cabin on a sleigh. The snow was still deep, but they made it through. Mrs. Henderson took one look at Grace and pronounced her healthy and on schedule. "Baby will come within the month, I expect," she said. "Maybe sooner. First babies can be unpredictable." The baby, a boy, arrived 3 weeks later on a cold March morning. Owen paced outside the cabin while Mrs. Henderson and Grace worked inside. He heard Grace cry out several times, and each time felt like a knife to his heart. But finally, after what seemed like hours, he heard a new sound, a thin, reedy wail that could only be a newborn baby. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. "Congratulations, Owen. You have a son, and your wife did beautifully." Owen rushed inside to find Grace propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up as he entered, and her smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Owen crossed to the bed on shaking legs. Grace pulled back the blanket to reveal a small, red, wrinkled face. The baby's eyes were closed and his tiny fists waved aimlessly. He was the most beautiful thing Owen had ever seen. "Can I hold him?" Owen asked hesitantly. "Of course. He is your son." Owen took the baby carefully, terrified he might break him. The baby weighed almost nothing, but when Owen looked down at his face, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. This tiny person depended on him, trusted him to keep him safe and provide for him. "We have not discussed names," Grace said. "Do you have any preferences?" Owen thought of his grandfather, a stern but fair man who had taught him to ride and shoot. "What about Oliver, after my grandfather?" "Oliver," Grace repeated, testing the name. "Oliver Vance, I like it." "Oliver it is then." Owen carefully handed the baby back to Grace and leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Thank you," he said. "For him, for everything, for staying, for taking a chance on me, for building this life with me." "Thank you for saving me," Grace replied. "Not just from the storm, but from a life of loneliness and regret. I love you, Owen." "I love you too. Both of you, my family." Mrs. Henderson stayed for 2 more weeks, helping Grace recover and teaching both new parents how to care for a baby. When she finally left, promising to return in the summer for a visit, Owen and Grace found themselves alone with their son. "Are we ready for this?" Grace asked one night as they watched Oliver sleep in his cradle, which Owen had built from pine wood and lined with soft flannel. "Probably not," Owen admitted, "but we will figure it out together," and they did. The first year of Oliver's life was hard, marked by sleepless nights and constant worry, but also by moments of pure joy. His first smile, the first time he rolled over, his first tooth. His first word, which was not quite mama, but close enough that Grace claimed victory. The cabin slowly transformed from the dwelling of a solitary man into a real home. Grace hung curtains she had sewn herself. Owen built a larger table and more chairs, anticipating a growing family. They added a small porch where they could sit on warm evenings and watch Oliver play in the dirt. In the spring of 1885, when Oliver was 2 years old, Grace announced she was pregnant again. This time, Owen was nothing but excited. They knew what to expect now, were better prepared. The pregnancy was easier than the first had been, and in January of 1886, they welcomed a daughter into the world. They named her Rose, after the wild roses that grew near the cabin every summer. She had her mother's green eyes and a temperament that was somehow both sweet and fierce. Oliver was initially suspicious of this new addition to the family, but Grace patiently taught him to be gentle with his baby sister, and soon he was her devoted protector. The years passed in a blur of work and growth. Owen expanded his trap lines and began breeding horses, a venture that proved surprisingly profitable. Grace started teaching not just Oliver and Rose, but several other children from nearby ranches whose parents heard about her education and begged her to teach their children as well. Twice a week, weather permitting, children would ride to the Vance cabin for lessons. In 1888, Grace gave birth to another son, whom they named James. In 1890, another daughter, Clara, arrived. The cabin was bursting at the seams now, and Owen began work on the larger house he had always planned. It took 2 years to complete, built with the help of neighbors and friends they had made in the area. The new house had 4 bedrooms, a real kitchen with a cast iron stove, and a parlor with windows that looked out over the valley. Grace cried the first time she walked through it, overwhelmed by how far they had come from that desperate winter day when Owen had pulled her from the wreckage of her wagon. "Do you ever regret it?" Owen asked her that night as they lay in their new bedroom, listening to the sounds of their children sleeping in the rooms down the hall. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had gone to Cheyenne?" Grace rolled over to face him. She was 38 now, with strands of silver threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes from years of laughter and sun. But to Owen, she was more beautiful than ever. "Never," Grace said firmly. "Not once. This life, this family, it is everything I never knew I wanted." "You are everything I never knew I needed." "I used to think I wanted to be alone," Owen confessed, "that other people were just complications, But you taught me that life without love, without family, is not really living at all." "We taught each other," Grace corrected. "That is what marriage is, I think. Teaching each other how to be better, how to love more fully." In 1895, the railroad finally did come through Wyoming, bringing more people and more opportunities. Lusk grew from a tiny outpost into a real town with a school, a doctor, and even a bank. Grace stopped teaching at the house and took a position at the new school, where she taught reading and arithmetic to children from all over the county. Owen's horse breeding business flourished. He became known throughout Wyoming for producing strong, steady mounts that could handle the harsh winters and rough terrain. Ranchers came from as far away as Montana to buy his horses. Oliver, who was now 16, worked alongside his father, learning the business. He had Owen's height and Grace's intelligence, and showed every sign of being a fine horseman. Rose, at 14, was studying to be a teacher like her mother. James and Clara, 12 and 10 respectively, were still finding their paths but showed promise in their own ways. One evening in the spring of 1897, Owen and Grace sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The children were inside, ostensibly doing homework but more likely causing mischief. From inside came the sound of laughter and good-natured arguing. "Do you remember the day we met?" Grace asked. "That terrible storm." "I remember everything about that day," Owen said. "I remember thinking I was too late, that you were already frozen. I remember how you insisted on saving that trunk. I remember how scared I was that I would not be able to get you back to the cabin in time. I remember seeing you appear through the snow and thinking you looked like something out of a storybook. This rough cowboy who came out of nowhere to rescue me. I was terrified and grateful and so cold." "You told me you would leave in the spring," Owen said. "I did," Grace agreed. "I truly believed it at the time. I thought I was just waiting out the winter until I could continue on to Cheyenne. I had no idea that I had already arrived exactly where I was supposed to be. I am glad you stayed." "So am I. Every single day, I am glad I stayed." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands as they had done countless times over the past 15 years. The mountains turned purple in the fading light, and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside, one of the children called out for their mother and Grace started to rise, but Owen gently pulled her back. "Let them wait a minute," he said. "I want to remember this. You and me and the life we built together. All of it started because of a storm." "No," Grace corrected gently. "It started because you were brave enough to ride out into that storm to save a stranger. And because I was brave enough to trust you, to let myself love again, to build something new instead of clinging to what I had lost." "We were both brave," Owen said, "and we are both blessed." The years continued to pass, bringing joys and sorrows as all years do. In 1902, Oliver married a rancher's daughter from Cheyenne, bringing a new daughter-in-law into the family. The following year, they made Owen and Grace grandparents for the first time. Rose became a teacher, taking a position at a school in Cheyenne but returning home for summers and holidays. James and Clara grew into capable young adults, finding their own paths in the changing West. Owen's hair turned gray, then white. His hands, which had been so strong when he pulled Grace from that snowdrift, became gnarled with arthritis. But they could still hold his wife, still touch her face with tenderness. Grace developed a persistent cough that worried Owen, but the doctor assured them it was nothing serious, just the result of years in the harsh Wyoming climate. In the spring of 1910, nearly 30 years after that fateful storm, Owen and Grace took a trip back to the original cabin. It still stood, though they had not lived in it for years. They used it occasionally for storage, but mostly it sat empty, a monument to where their life together had begun. They stood in the doorway, looking at the single room that had sheltered them through that brutal winter. It seemed so small now, almost impossibly so. How had they both fit in here? How had they managed for months in this tiny space? "It is hard to believe we lived here," Grace said, echoing Owen's thoughts. "It is hard to believe how far we have come," Owen replied. "From this cabin to the house. From two people alone in the world to a family of 4 children and grandchildren. From strangers to the great love of my life," Grace finished. She turned to Owen, her green eyes still bright despite the years. "That is what you are, you know, the great love of my life. I did not know such love was possible until I found it with you." Owen pulled her close, ignoring the protest of his arthritic joints. "And you are mine. You will always be mine, Grace, in this life and whatever comes after." They stood there in the doorway of that old cabin, two people who had weathered storms both literal and figurative, who had built a life from nothing, who had loved and been loved in return. The wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the scent of wild roses. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang. Owen thought back to that day 28 years ago when he had found a desperate woman trapped in an overturned wagon. How could he have known then that saving her would mean saving himself? That pulling her from the storm would pull him from his own isolation and loneliness. That her promise to leave in spring would become a promise to stay forever. Life, Owen reflected, was full of unexpected gifts. Some came wrapped in disaster. Some arrived in the form of a brutal winter storm. But all of them, if you were wise enough to recognize them and brave enough to accept them, could change everything. "Come on," Grace said, tugging at his hand. "Let us go home. The children are coming for dinner and I want to make sure everything is ready." Home, what a beautiful word. What a perfect word for what they had built together. They walked away from the cabin, hand in hand, heading toward the house that stood in the distance. Their house, filled with the evidence of their life together, the children and grandchildren who were their legacy. Behind them, the old cabin stood silent in the spring sunshine, guardian of their history, witness to where their love had begun. And if you listened carefully, on quiet nights when the wind blew just right, you could almost hear echoes of that long-ago winter. The crackle of fire, the sound of two voices learning to harmonize, the first tentative words of a love that would last a lifetime. Grace had said she would leave in spring, but she never did. She stayed, and in staying, found everything she had been searching for without knowing it. And Owen, who had saved her from the storm, found that in saving her, he had been saved in return.